Welcome back to Tiger Moon. Welcome to part 3 of season 2 of Dahak the Haunted Village. In the previous episode, Muhammad's friends came to Ramin's house. Everything was going well until one of them accepted a challenge during a game and headed toward the abandoned hill. What happened there changed everything. Now, let's continue the story. Muhammad's friends weren't eager for our secret to become public, but after seeing Yasser's condition, we headed straight to the village sheikh's house. It was around 5 in the morning. When we knocked on the door, we heard the sheikh's voice. It sounded like we had just woken him up. Muhammad asked him to come outside. The moment he saw Yasser, he immediately realized something was terribly wrong. Muhammad asked if we could come inside and explain everything. The sheikh led us into a room where a lamp was already burning. It seemed he was alone in the house. Muhammad explained the game of spin the bottle and what had happened to Yasser, but he carefully avoided mentioning everything that had happened before. Muhammad's friends had bloodshot eyes. When the sheikh asked what was wrong with them, they blamed it on lack of sleep. The sheikh looked at Yasser and quietly asked, "Are you saying this young man has been possessed?" Muhammad answered nervously, "That's exactly what we're trying to find out. That's why we brought him here. Can anything be done for him?" The sheikh picked up an old Quran from a shelf and sat beside Yasser. Yasser's eyes were closed. A faint sound escaped from his throat. The sheikh himself looked uncertain. Several times he tried to speak, then stopped himself. Finally, he gathered his courage. "I've never seen anything like this before. Tell me the truth. I promise your secret will stay with me. I need to know whether what you're telling me is true, or if this young man ended up like this because of drinking alcohol." Before Muhammad could answer, the same man who had given Yasser the dare quickly said, "God forgive us, Sheikh. Thank you for your concern." The Sheikh frowned. "You don't speak. The smell coming from your mouth is enough to make me perform funeral purification." Muhammad signaled for his friend to stay quiet. "The truth is, Sheikh, Yasser's condition has nothing to do with alcohol. Everything I told you is exactly what happened." The color drained from the Sheikh's face. He looked at poor Yasser once more. After a long moment of thought, he stood up and left the room. As soon as the door closed, the man who had given the dare muttered, "He's even more frightened than Yasser. I bet he's already lost his ablution from fear." Under normal circumstances, we would have laughed for half an hour, but none of us felt like laughing. A minute later, the sheikh returned carrying a white cloth. After closing the door, he glared at the young man before sitting beside Yasser. The young man immediately turned red with embarrassment. It seemed the sheikh had heard every word. The sheikh placed the white cloth over Yasser's face and prepared to begin reciting the Quran. Before opening it, he said, "As I told you, I have never dealt with something like this. But my late father once told me stories. If an evil spirit truly exists inside this young man, it should become disturbed by the words of God. We may need several people to help. But if anyone in this room neglects their prayers or rarely performs them, please leave now. Otherwise, the evil spirit may try to enter them instead." Silence filled the room. None of us wanted to admit anything. To break the awkwardness, I stood up. Muhammad's 3 friends stood up with me. Only Muhammad remained inside. Soon, the sheikh began reciting verses from the Quran. The 4 of us waited outside the room, shivering, mostly because of the freezing cold. About 30 minutes passed. The man who had given the dare sighed miserably. "If I'd known it was this cold out here, I would have prayed." Little by little, the sun rose over the horizon. My eyelids grew heavy. Eventually, I fell asleep. About an hour later, Mohammed woke us up. Smiling with relief, he told us that Yasser was feeling much better. All of us rushed inside. Yasser was sitting upright with one hand on his head. The sheikh continued advising him. Finally, he handed to Yasser a necklace, exactly like the one he had once given me. Before we left, the sheikh told him, "You should wear a protective amulet so this doesn't happen again." Yasser had no idea what he meant. He simply thanked him and innocently replied, "I'll buy one from the grocery shop across from the mosque." The sheikh sighed in disappointment, then he said goodbye. Muhammad's friends dropped us off at our house before leaving. Muhammad and I walked inside. Completely exhausted, we fell asleep almost immediately. Around 3 in the afternoon, I woke up. Muhammad was still asleep. I went to the bathroom. Then I checked on the chickens. After that, I decided to cook lunch before waking Muhammad. When lunch was ready, I called him. He got up like an old man on his deathbed. At first, I thought he was sick, but he insisted he was only tired. After lunch, we lay in front of the television as usual. Before we realized it, evening had arrived. A few minutes later, the village's call to prayer echoed through the air. The moment it ended, we heard another motorcycle. Less than a second later, someone began pounding violently on the front door. Mohammed and I rushed outside. When we opened it, two of his friends were standing there. Something terrible had happened. Yasser's condition had become much worse. The villagers had taken him to the mosque. Without wasting another second, we grabbed our coats, climbed onto their motorcycles, and hurried there. When we arrived, the mosque's doors were locked. The young man who had given the dare questioned the shopkeeper across the street. He told us that Yasser had suddenly run out of the mosque, and half the village had chased after him. For almost 30 minutes, we searched every corner of the village. There was no sign of Yasser nor of the villagers. Finally, we decided to go to the Sheikh's house instead. The moment we shut off the motorcycles, we heard loud shouting coming from inside. There was no need to knock. The front door was already open. Inside the courtyard, a large crowd had gathered. Everyone was talking at once. We pushed through the crowd and climbed the stairs. Yasser was lying in the very same room as the night before, but this time, everything was different. Four men were pinning down his arms and legs. The poor Sheikh's face had turned bright red as he recited the Quran. I doubted it was fear. It looked more like embarrassment, because Yasser was screaming the most insulting curses imaginable, and every single one of them was directed at the Sheikh. Muhammad rushed forward and tried to stop him. The Sheikh looked up and said, "Don't bother. The one speaking isn't Yasser." Those words sent a wave of fear through everyone in the room. For another 30 minutes, the cursing continued. Then suddenly, a commotion rose from the crowd outside. Moments later, an elderly woman with her robe tied around her waist entered the room carrying a woven basket. The villagers called her Kinesa. She immediately asked for burning charcoal from the expression on the Sheikh's face. It was obvious he wasn't pleased to see her inside his home. Perhaps he believed Kinesa could help, or perhaps he simply thought she deserved to receive a few of the insults herself. When the charcoal was ready, Kinesa sprinkled wild rue seeds over it and carried the smoking brazier around the room. Then she placed it above Yasser's head. Yasser kept cursing at the Sheikh. He paid no attention to Kinesa at all. Amid all the chaos, I noticed something strange. The man who had dared Yasser was sitting with his head lowered. His hands covered his face as if he were crying. For a brief moment, I actually felt sorry for him, but when he wiped away his tears, I caught sight of the grin on his face. I couldn't believe it. The man responsible for all of this was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Apparently, hearing the poor sheikh being insulted had completely broken his self-control. I kept staring at that walking disaster in disbelief. Then I realized I was about to start laughing myself. The last thing I wanted was to laugh in a moment like that, but every time I looked at him, it became harder to stop. Just then, Kinesa rescued me from the situation. She called my name and handed me a piece of cloth. Put this between his teeth. It wasn't easy. Yasser barely opened his mouth while cursing. In fact, it almost seemed as though he didn't even need to open it to speak. Finally, the moment his teeth separated just a little, I forced the cloth into his mouth. In one swift motion, Kinesa tied another cloth tightly over it. The sheikh immediately stopped reciting the Quran. "What are you doing, woman? He's going to suffocate." Without even looking at him, Kinesa replied, "If you enjoy being cursed so much, I can insult you myself." Suddenly, the young man who had given the dare burst into a fit of coughing and ran out of the room. Apparently, he couldn't hold back his laughter any longer. After Yasser's mouth had been tied shut, Kinesa covered his face with a black cloth. His struggling grew weaker, and naturally, the cursing stopped. Even if he wanted to continue, he couldn't. Although the next day was the beginning of the week, the villagers refused to leave the sheikh's house. They had lit a fire in the courtyard and were drinking tea while waiting. Kinesa picked up a needle and pricked the soles of Yasser's feet. Once again, the sheikh objected. Before long, they were arguing. Several village elders stepped in to calm them. Kinesa frowned. "This young man has hardly read the Quran his entire life. He won't surrender easily. But if I make that spirit suffer, I can force it to come out." One of the old men quietly whispered, "There is no power except God," then walked out of the room. At that moment, Haji Yadola, who had always been fascinated by these matters, spoke up. "Why don't both of you work together? Can't you hear his mother's cries?" Kinisa answered coldly, "Tell him that. I have no problem." Then, something terrifying happened. A strange voice echoed through the room. It mocked every single person standing there. Everyone froze. Their eyes slowly turned toward Yasser. The voice was so powerful, even a deaf man could have heard it. The sheikh resumed reciting the Quran in a trembling voice. Kinesa slowly stepped backward, then she quietly said, "They've taken him. It's too late now." Even the young man who had been laughing only moments earlier fell completely silent. After that mysterious voice echoed through the room, the atmosphere changed. The entire house became unbearably heavy. No one wanted to stay inside anymore. Haji Yadola suggested that everyone leave the room and discuss what to do. The sheikh placed the Quran on Yasser's chest. "I think we'd better continue this conversation in the next room." Fear was written across every face in the courtyard. Even the constant whispering had stopped. A few moments later, the sheikh opened the door and called the four of us inside. Once we entered, he asked Muhammad to tell everyone the whole story. After all, he had promised to keep our secret. Seeing how serious everything had become, Muhammad confessed everything, from the drinking to everything that had happened on the hill. Haji Yadola muttered a few words under his breath. Then he turned toward me. Well done, Mr. Ramin. You had already experienced these things yourself. How could you agree to let this happen? At that moment, I wished I could turn into one of the flower pots sitting silently on the shelf. Muhammad immediately came to my defense. He tried to stop Yasser. He wasn't encouraging him. The sheikh interrupted them. Blaming each other won't solve anything. We need a solution. Hinesa calmly suggested. Chain him in the basement of his family's house and leave him there until the day he dies. Haji Yadola exploded with anger. If it were your own child, would you still say that? Kinesa stepped forward defiantly. My child knows better than to stick his head into every dark hole. Once again, the sheikh urged everyone to calm down. Outside, Yasser's mother could still be heard crying again and again. She cursed whoever had caused this tragedy. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Then suddenly, an idea came to me. Hopefully, I asked, Sheikh, what if you contact your late father's old friend? The Sheikh looked at me in confusion. My father's friend? Who do you mean? Before I could answer, Haji Yadola spoke. The man your late father brought to the village years ago. The one who dealt with the curse. Is he still alive? The sheikh stood there silently for a moment, then suddenly hurried toward the telephone. Everyone in the room watched him without saying a word. The tension was overwhelming. Finally, he spoke. Peace be upon you. That meant someone had answered. The sheikh briefly explained everything. Then he listened. A few seconds later, he said, Yes, I'm afraid tomorrow will be too late. If possible, please leave tonight. Haji Yadola interrupted him. Tell him we'll send Esmail to pick him up. The sheikh repeated the message. As luck would have it, Esmail was one of the few villagers who wasn't at the sheikh's house. Someone went to find him. About half an hour later, he arrived. Haji Yadola scolded him. What took you so long? Esmail looked at his watch and replied, Haji, I have to be on the road by 5. Of course, he was exaggerating. The first winter bus didn't even leave until 7. In the end, Haji Yadola and Esmail decided to drive out and bring the old man back to the village. Suddenly, Haji Yadola called my name. Ramin, you're coming with us. After I climbed into the van, he quietly leaned toward me. It's better if you stay away from here for now. Kinesa can't keep a secret. If she starts talking, no one will ever look at you as the village teacher again. Together with Haji Yadola and Esmail, we headed toward the city. The road was completely dark. Not a single light could be seen. Nearly 2 hours later, we finally reached the district. Haji Yadola kept staring anxiously at the road ahead. He was thinking the same thing I was. By the time we returned, it would already be morning, and no one knew what might happen to Yasser before then. We had barely left the district behind when we entered the terrifying mountain road. On both sides of the road, towering mountains stood like giant demons. In the darkness, they looked even more mysterious. The dimly lit road had completely driven the sleep from Esmail's eyes. At that hour, ours was the only vehicle on the road. Not a single other car could be seen. My eyelids were slowly growing heavy when the sound of a car horn suddenly jolted me awake. It kept honking again and again. Annoyed, Esmail glanced into the rear view mirror and muttered, Come on already, just pass us, you idiot. But the unseen driver kept honking, like a fly buzzing inside our ears. Finally, Esmail gave up. He pulled the van over and came to a complete stop. We waited. Nothing happened. No car ever passed us. Esmail looked at me in disbelief. Teacher, you saw that too, didn't you? Still stunned, I slowly nodded. Just then, Haji Yadola's voice came from the back. What's wrong, Esmail? Flat tire? Esmail answered with a half-hearted no, then started driving again. About half an hour passed. We had reached the steep mountain passes. All it would take was 1 second of sleep, and Esmail would never wake up again, so I kept talking to him the whole time. As the night grew deeper, a thick fog spread across the road. We were approaching the final mountain pass when the same horn echoed behind us again. Esmail nervously checked the mirror. Damn it, I can hear it, but I can't see any car. I stood up and walked to the back of the van. Pulling the curtain aside, I saw nothing but darkness and fog. Before I could say anything, we reached the bend. From the rear window, I suddenly saw a woman step into the middle of the road. Ya Abul Fazl! Esmail slammed on the brakes. The force threw me across the floor of the van. Haji Yadola didn't even know who to check on first. Without saying a word, Esmail jumped out of the van. I cursed him under my breath. Then Haji and I climbed out as well. There was no woman anywhere. Esmail searched the road like someone looking for a dead body. Finally, Haji spoke. Esmail, don't you think you're wasting your time? Esmail looked at him in disbelief. What do you mean? I just hit someone. Haji pointed at the empty road. Then where is she? If you'd hit even a sparrow, we would have heard it. I didn't hear anything. Did you, Ramin? Still rubbing my sore nose? I answered, yes. I heard my face smashing into the floor of the van. Ismail let out a deep breath. Sorry, teacher. I had no choice. Haji quietly pointed toward the broken guardrail beside the cliff. Oh, you had another choice. You could have driven us straight into the valley trying to avoid that ghost. At last, Esmail began to understand. He slowly sat down on the roadside. A few minutes later, before another vehicle could come along, we climbed back into the van and continued our journey. The entire time, Haji Adola quietly recited protective verses under his breath and blew into the air. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we finally reached the address we had been given, before we even knocked. A tall man, about 50 years old, appeared in the doorway. From the way he was dressed, it was obvious he had been expecting us. After a brief greeting, he immediately walked toward the van. We should leave as quickly as possible. He carried a large sports bag. For some reason, I was certain it wasn't filled with gym clothes. We had barely left the city. When Haji explained everything that had happened, the man finally spoke. He began telling us about the tricks of the jinn. Still shaken by the road, Esmail asked, so, was that woman a jinn? The man nodded immediately. As long as I am with you, they won't come near. Strangely enough, nothing unusual appeared on the road after that, not once. By the time we reached the district, I had fallen asleep. Around 8 o'clock that morning, we finally returned to the village. Ismail dropped us off, exhausted, before leaving for work. When we entered the sheikh's house, most of the crowd had already gone home. I wanted to hurry to school, but the sheikh stopped me. The village council has declared Saturday a holiday. I had to struggle not to smile. The sheikh warmly embraced the man, although I still didn't know his real name. In my mind, I simply called him the exorcist. The sheikh wanted to explain Yasser's condition in detail, but the exorcist raised his hand. There is no need. Muhammad and his friends were asleep in the next room. Only Yasser's parents remained beside him. Yasser had calmed down. Every now and then, a deep growling sound escaped from his throat. The exorcist looked at him carefully, then requested that everyone leave the room. Even Yasser's mother had to be persuaded before stepping outside. About half an hour later, the exorcist opened the door and allowed us back in. The sheikh immediately asked, Mr. Molay, what did you find? The exorcist answered, we must wait until tonight. As I suspected, we're dealing with a very cunning spirit. During the day, it hides inside its shell, but at night, it reveals itself. The sheikh looked even more surprised. So yesterday, his improvement wasn't really because of what I did. Kinessa smirked. While packing away his belongings, the exorcist replied, your efforts weren't useless, but they weren't the cure. I asked for permission to go back home and return at night. Instead, the sheikh insisted, until this is over, everyone stays here. The exorcist agreed. Then he pointed toward one of the young men. You, come here. The rest of you, outside. Everyone left except the man who had dared Yasser. About 10 minutes later, he came out and called another friend inside. Then Muhammad was invited in. Haji Yadola whispered, I think he's checking each of them to see if they've been affected. When Muhammad finally came out, I walked toward the room. I had barely crossed the doorway when the exorcist smiled. You don't have a problem. The previous young man wasn't affected much either. Since I wanted to make use of the opportunity, I asked him why. He invited me to sit beside Yasser, then pointed toward Yasser's closed eyes. As you already know, they feed on fear. That's why they always try to make themselves known. When they don't have enough strength, you only hear them. When you become afraid, they begin showing you things. And once fear completely fills your heart, you may catch a glimpse of only part of what they truly are. His explanation sounded like something straight out of a Hollywood movie. It hadn't answered my question at all. So I replied, that's certainly interesting. But what does it have to do with what I asked? The exorcist laughed. You and the previous young man were in your normal state. The more detached the human mind becomes from reality, the easier it is for them to reveal themselves. That's one reason some wandering mystics use intoxicating substances. This young man saw things while he was drunk, things that would have terrified him to death if he'd been completely sober. I quickly nodded. So, we should thank God he was drunk. The exorcist laughed again. Yes, thank God. But here's the important part. If he hadn't been intoxicated, they wouldn't have appeared to him in the first place. I was about to tell him about everything I had experienced myself when the sheikh suddenly rushed into the room barefoot. Breakfast is ready, he smiled. Everyone, come and eat. A large breakfast spread had been prepared in the next room. There was plenty of food, though thankfully no sheep's head or lentil soup. After breakfast, I asked Haji Yadola for permission to get some sleep. When I woke up, it was already lunchtime. To my surprise, Yasser looked completely normal. He was laughing and joking with his friends as if nothing had happened. Muhammad quietly reminded me that the exorcist, Mr. Molai, had specifically warned us not to tell Yasser anything about what had happened. Meanwhile, Haji Adola and the sheikh walked through the village, asking everyone not to gather at the sheikh's house again, just to watch the exorcism. Yasser couldn't understand why he was staying at the sheikh's house. Deep down, he clearly remembered parts of what had happened, but he didn't have the courage to talk about it, or even ask any questions. The hours slowly passed. Muhammad, his friends, and I sat in the courtyard talking. The evening call to prayer had only just ended, when Yasser suddenly let out another terrifying scream. The sheikh had gone to the mosque, but thankfully, Mr. Molay was right there with us. And that's where part 3 comes to an end. Part 4 will most likely be ready on Sunday. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to leave a like. Your support helps this series reach more people. As the old saying goes, some wounds can fade with a cold breeze, but never the ones earned for someone worth facing the storm. Until next time, may God protect you. With respect, Tiger Moon.